Good evening, everyone. I'd like to call to order the Planning and Development Committee meeting for May 17th, 2023. First off, any disclosure of pecuniary interest? Seeing none. Need a mover and seconder for approval of the agenda. Councillor Frake, Councillor Bradsey. Moved by Councillor Frake, second by Councillor Bradsey. Resolved that the May 17th, 2023 Planning and Development Committee agenda be approved. All in favor? That's carried. All right, now we move to receipt of previous minutes. Grimsby Heritage Advisory Committee meeting of May 9th, 2023. Need a mover and seconder. Moved by Member Potter, second by Councillor Bradsey. Moved by Member Potter, second by Councillor Bradsey. Resolved that the Grimsby Heritage Advisory Committee minutes of May 9th, 2023 be received. All in favor? That's carried. All right, now we'll move to discussion reports, PA 2318, Bill 97, and the provincial planning statement. Just need a mover and seconder to get it on the floor. Councillor Frake, Member Drew. Matt. All right, go ahead, Matt. Good evening. Nice to see you.
Good evening, members of the committee. Good to see you as well. Just wait a second. There we go. Here to provide just a very brief overview. There we go. It's not all doom and gloom because of the provincial policy. Look, the darkness comes down. Okay, so I'm here before you just to give you an update, a little bit of a brief presentation in combination with the report that we're bringing forward tonight on two key pieces of legislation that really impact planning policy. It's kind of a continuation of what we've been seeing from the province with respect to, working towards adhering to those housing targets that were set forward. So we have Bill 97, which is Helping Home Buyers and Protecting Tenants Act. There's a bunch of changes we'll take you through. There's a bunch of planning legislation that's impacted by that. And then we also have a draft provincial planning statement that's been proposed by the province. This is a significant document. It's the key piece of planning legislation at a provincial level. What this is proposing to do is, again, going along the theme of streamlining kind of consideration of planning matters as they pertain to housing. This is combining the provincial growth plan and the provincial policy statement. So really, the general theme in this, there seems to be provision of more flexibility to encourage more housing options. It's kind of shifting from a adhere to or conform with to a be consistent with type of policy framework. And the intent is to, again, I think, allow municipalities to be a little more nimble, responding to their local market conditions, again, with the outcome, the desired outcome of working towards more housing. So they came forward, when was it, Terry? April 6th. Bill 97, the comment period was very, very quick. May 6th, we were required to submit comments. We did so. They're included in this report. We did so, kind of as an informal submission, and then we would formalize it, bringing it forward to committee, just because that's all the time allowed for. With the provincial planning statement, the draft that's before us all, the deadline for comments is June 5th. Yes, so we're before you today. We've included a bunch of comments and clarifications we're seeking in the associated report. So, next slide, please. We'll dive right into it. From a growth perspective, excuse me, got a couple of notes for you. From a growth perspective, the main thing here was as we all know, the growth plan provided growth targets to upper and single-tier municipalities. They got, kind of divvied out to lower-tier municipalities. Those growth targets and that language hasn't been carried forward in the provincial planning statement. In addition, some definitions haven't been carried forward. When we talk about green fields, we talk about built-up areas and things of that such. So, we're expecting further information on implementation to be released, but right now, we still believe that we're going to be adhering to those 2051 planning horizon targets that were included in the growth plan, because we haven't seen any details as to otherwise. But otherwise, looking out into the future, based on these changes, it's now anticipated that we would have to, develop our own growth targets as we move forward as a municipality. Again, responding to kind of local circumstances and things like that. From a housing perspective, there's been a bunch of different kind of definitions added, more to support kind of that intensification theme. Definitions: rooming houses, garden suites, laneway houses, mid to high-rise apartments, things like that, to kind of broaden the definition category with respect to policy configurations, different housing arrangements, student housing, farm housing, all those kind of broadening of the definitions. There's still, from a general perspective, the policy direction to provide for a range of housing options, that hasn't changed. That's been in place for a long time. But we're seeing kind of a shift in definitions, even a shift away from affordable housing. That's kind of a definition that hasn't really been carried forward in this draft document. Instead, I think it's assisted needs housing instead, which is more, targeting things like long-term care homes and accessibility needs and things like that. So those different types of housing considerations. So a little bit of a shift there as well in terms of definitions. From a settlement area perspective, this one's very interesting. Whenever there was a settlement area expansion that was sought by anybody, it was subject to, a larger process called a municipal comprehensive review. That only came along when the region did an update to their official plan. It was a periodic undertaking, very involved undertaking. Now, with this new legislation, a very significant change is that moving forward, individuals, whoever wants to make such a request, they don't have to wait for that municipal comprehensive review process. They could initiate at any time. So that's significant. However, when you look at the town of Grimsby, there's kind of a limited potential for impact, just because this doesn't apply to specialty crop lands that are within the Greenbelt. That is something that is still not on the table in terms of settlement area expansions at this time into specialty crop areas. Same with Niagara Escarpment Plan areas. So those are largely what constrains the urban areas of Grimsby. So at this point, we see limited impact. But again, just sharing that this is a significant change and kind of, again, demonstrates a little bit of that continued tone change coming from the province in favor of more housing and more space to provide that housing. Employment areas, again, the definition has changed there as well. A lot more specific in terms of those traditional type employment uses, the manufacturing, the warehousing. Explicitly now does not include things like institutional uses, any retail or commercial uses, unless they are directly related to that more traditional employment use. So that's, again, a shift in a definition, and it could have some potential impact, generally speaking, because if you have a standalone use that's not considered one of those traditional employment uses, but it's in an employment area, well, you have to have policy recognition in your official plan to allow for that use. Otherwise, and again, further clarifications being sought, but there could be a need to redesignate an employment area designation if it includes one of those uses that don't meet the definition. So good news is, we're initiating a comprehensive review and overhaul of the town official plan, and we can likely be nimble in whatever direction we need to go in that regard. But again, that's, we're hoping for some further clarification, but there could be some implications there. Agricultural and rural areas, there's another significant shift here. Again, not specific to specialty croplands in the Greenbelt, but other rural areas, prime agricultural areas. There has now been the introduction of flexibility to allow for some severances of lots, some lot creation in rural areas, up to 3 lots. There's also some more flexibility added in for additional dwelling units. Again, not on specialty croplands, but other prime agricultural lands in rural areas. So that has significant implications as well. You know, when you look at things like farm viability, typically larger farm parcels, generally speaking, provide, you know, a higher level of farm viability. So once you start potentially severing lots, you know, you could be impacting that. Again, limited potential here in Grimsby, but there are a little bit of lands that could be subject to that, same in Lincoln. So something definitely that signifies a big change. There are some criteria that are applied, you know, impacts to the agricultural operations that are adjacent in rural character, but we can get into that a little bit later. Next slide, please. Natural heritage. Interestingly enough, there isn't any policies included in the draft PPS in that regard. They haven't been released yet, but generally speaking, I think the theme remains that as we move forward, there's going to be more onus on municipalities to develop their own policies to protect natural heritage features and maybe even completion of some of the mapping. So again, that's a little bit of a shifting of responsibility as well, although not yet reflected in the provincial planning statement that's proposed. Cultural heritage policies, there are requirements now for, or recommendations that municipalities develop things like archaeological management plans and more strict policy guidance for evaluations in accordance with the Ontario Heritage Act. So a little bit more of a local responsibility now. Also, more policy direction for Indigenous engagement earlier on in projects and applications to make sure that their concerns are identified, you know, earlier on. So those are some significant changes that are identified in this new draft document. From a timing perspective, it's been noted that, you know, the province plans to release their policies, their complete set of policies in the fall of 2023, and then with a short period before actual implementation, likely into early 2024. I think this is something that, you know, we've commented on in the report, considering all of the legislation changes that have been happening in our planning world from a provincial level. More time would definitely be, you know, vital and important, not just to us, but to all municipalities, just because there's been a lot to implement. I mentioned Greenbelt policies a few times. I mentioned that some of these changes they're not taking effect on specialty croplands. So the Greenbelt policy, for the most part, is being recognized by the provincial planning statement, at least at the moment. So next slide, please. So there was some kind of clarification coming out of Bill 97 with some regulations, some of which were associated with Bill 93, or Bill 23, sorry, too many bills. Bill 109 as well. So if you recall, and we've talked about this a little bit in previous meetings, as I'm sure other staff members have, as a result of Bill 109, there was proposed quicker timelines for processing planning applications, and if municipalities didn't meet them, they were going to have to refund the planning application fees that were received. There was some clarification that came out of Bill 97 that indicated, which was kind of a promise made by the province previously, that implementation of that is deferred until July 1st of this year. There's also some verbiage in there that there's the opportunity for the province to identify certain municipalities where this wouldn't apply, where, you know, they wouldn't be subject to that requirement for refund of planning applications, and identify which. And as part of our staff comments, we said, you know, it makes sense. Any municipality really under 75,000 should be considered in that regard, which of course includes us, includes Grimsby, because, you know, just from a resource perspective, from a revenue perspective, we're constrained. All those smaller municipalities we're all feeling it, especially, you know, in these times with current market conditions and economic pressures. So that was a comment that we made. There was also a clarification with site plan process. If you recall, Bill 23 anything 10 units or 10 residential units or less, not subject to site plan control. A little bit of clarification that came out of Bill 97 saying that, well, those in proximity to a shoreline, 120 meters or 300 meters of a rail line, can still be subject to the site plan application process. Staff provided some commentary on that too, to open that up a little bit more. Areas where there's a clear compatibility concern, we'd like to see a little more consideration for site plan control. If you've got, you know, a proposed 18-story building and a 2 or 3 story building beside it, well, you know, I mean, that's a bad example given the unit count, but you get what I mean. Also looking at, you know, properties that are adjacent to cultural heritage resources, properties adjacent to 400 series highways, in the downtown areas where things are a lot more intensive, those types of areas, we still feel that there should be the option to subject those types of development proposals to a site plan process. So that was included in our commentary. Some clarifications just in terms of terms and some regulatory details. For example, one positive one was just around things like, you know, as part of Bill 23, we're required to permit more additional residential units per lot, but, you know, there's been some clarification that's come out in terms of, you know, the parking requirements. The first unit, the primary unit, it's been clarified now that it's still subject to whatever's in the zoning. That's good. And then we can add additional spaces for the additional units afterwards. There's also clarifications on when a complete application is and when the clock starts ticking on planning application. So now it's actually when we deem the application complete. There's been some clarification identified there, which is good news, although I'd like to see those timelines and refunds reconsidered anyway, but still some good news on that, at least some clarity that we can work with. Some additional criteria requests with settlement area expansions. Yes, they're now potentially able to be brought forward at any time, but there's some criteria associated with those just in terms of considering, you know, the adjacent land use character. There are some prescriptive items that are identified. I won't get into all of them in detail. Same with employment area conversions. There could be, you know, a better, well, not better, but there's consideration for impacts, but really the goal of those is to protect the employment use, not the sensitive land use that could be located in some proximity to it. The kind of the onus is on the protection of the employment area, so take that as you will. Again, with the guidance perspective, there's guidance on Indigenous engagement and some of the roles and responsibilities that we would play with that. The policies, as I mentioned, they do recognize the green belt. And finally, on timing, you know, one of the things that's interesting is, you know, when this does become implemented, whether it's early, mid-2024, however this ends up shaking out, once it's implemented, even if we don't have official plans that are updated, we're going to have to conform to the new PPS. Not really unusual. That's typically, you know, when you see things like zoning amendments and official plan amendments come forward, it's oftentimes, or it can be because local planning documents haven't yet been updated just because of the frequency of all these provincial updates. So that's kind of been clarified as well. And really, I mean, those are kind of the big ticket items. We did provide more of a comprehensive outline in the report. But generally speaking, again, you know, we're looking at more flexibility being offered to municipalities. Kind of, when I looked at it previously in the provincial policy that was in place up until now, you know, you could see very clearly what the province was dictating. Here's how much you're going to grow by. Here's kind of the form and everything that we're encouraging. And there still is encouragement of that form, but there seems to be some flexibility in when and how that happens a little bit. That's been implemented by the province, I think, in some ways, to allow the municipality to at least a little bit better shape growth in their municipality. But again, with all the other policies still encouraging intensification and growth and provision of housing. So I leave you with that, and if there's any questions, myself and I'll invite Terry up as well. We'd be happy to answer them. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Matt. Questions? Councillor Frick.
Thank you, Matt. You have lots of fun ahead of you with all these bills. I just want to talk about I don't know where to start, actually, because there's so many categories here. Can you put up one of I think the first slide that you had? Oh, sorry, Katie. I just want to guide, something that the guide us here, because I'm sure that there's a lot of material in there, and as you were going through it, I was thinking about things I wanted to ask, and I probably forgot them when you got to the last slide, so. Yeah. Employment areas. You mentioned that there are some exclusions from the current legislation. Is that right? You said, I think you mentioned institutions and something along those lines. Can you just go back through that again?
Yeah, sure. And through you, Mr. Mayor, yeah, that's just the definitions now, very explicitly excluding things like institutional uses or any standalone retail, commercial, office-type operations that aren't associated directly with those employment uses.
So how does that get managed? That type of development, like a retail plaza, for example, is that considered in that particular exclusion?
Yeah, that's a good question, and one we were contemplating as well. I think the intent is for any of those standalone uses, those retail, those commercial, they're more, being directed now to mixed use areas and things like that, areas that would promote for kind of a range of uses already. I think about, an area, at least in Lincoln, it would be general commercial or our central business districts downtown where we have an opportunity for mixed use style uses. So that's where, I think it's envisioned to go.
So it leaves us to deal with, and two parts to this question, it leaves us to deal with the larger commercial, industrial, heaven forbid, I don't think there's much space for manufacturing per se, but it leaves us to deal with that and exclude the others, the institutions and retailers and so on and so forth. Is that correct? That is correct.
Yeah, what it does is it just identifies areas that are actually designated for employment. Those are kind of restricted to the uses, again, more traditional styles, some of that manufacturing, the warehousing, things like that. All the other uses that we talked about, the office uses, the commercial uses, the retail, the small scale or larger scale retail that are standalone, they would be located to other areas like your mixed use areas or your along your main streets if you have commercial land use permissions or things like that, but not those, the intent is that those ones that are excluded are not within the employment areas.
Okay. The other thing, with Bill, I get all these bills straight in my head, Bill 109, how much, to what level of authority comes to council if we want to, if a developer comes and wants to build a commercial building, I mean, does Bill 109 apply to that? Or is that excluded from, I mean, I know residential is now kind of free-for-all kind of thing, but is it the same thing for the commercial? Do we get an opportunity to have any controls around that at all? I mean, as far as the council is concerned, because council is taken out of the equation more or less with Bill 109, right?
Well, it's
with the site application.
Not so much Bill 109, but kind of a combination of these. Yeah, I mean, there's more, as you said, there's more permissions as of right for residential. For commercial, it would depend. There are properties now within Grimsby that have that land use permission already. It would depend on the kind of the complexity of it. There still could be a site plan process, but again, that's delegated. I think your role in those commercial type uses would be if there's any zoning relief required or if there's a piece of land that isn't necessarily designated for commercial, but that's what the applicant wants, it would come through council through an official plan amendment. So there's still mechanisms where you might be involved, but again, if there's land use permissions that are already in place, if there's any type of commercial land use permission already on the property, it could be permitted and it wouldn't come through council.
I just feel that we've had the rug ripped up from underneath us because we're trying to push more, or we would like to push more of the business-related type of development, and I say business as an umbrella for everything that's considered business, because our tax in this town is 10% commercial business, whatever, and everything else is residential. So 90%, 10%. So if we start getting restrictions around the development of anything that is a business, it kind of counterproductive for us, because I think one of our objectives was to up the 10% to maybe up to 20, whatever. I don't know if you want to speak to that, or if there's, I don't even know what you can say, to be honest with you, so.
Well, I think first of all, what I would say is I agree with you, and it's a problem that a lot of planners are dealing with. Again, I hate that I keep bringing up Lincoln, but I'm dealing with it in Lincoln too, because again, we're kind of in the same boat in terms of employment lands or lands that are designated for that mixed use or commercial. We don't have a ton of it in Lincoln either. So I think we can still look to develop some kind of more stringent or at least a policy guidance that would limit conversion of those lands that we currently have to make sure that we maximize the potential. I think here what we're talking about with the provincial planning statement that's been proposed is the focus of employment areas is almost hearkening back to kind of the even more previous traditional uses where we had those whole D6 compatibility guidelines from the Ministry of Environment that we had to, deal with when we were assessing compatibility. I think it's hearkening back to that a little bit and pushing the other uses that aren't necessarily in that definition to, again, other areas within the municipality and out of the employment areas. But I can tell you, I work with our economic development department all the time to try to make sure that we're maximizing commercial uses and attracting commercial and retail uses, because I agree with you, you need a better balance or as good of one as you can achieve. And that's a lens that I think we'll continue to look through as we move forward. But I'd be, remiss if I didn't say that a lot of this policy revision that's come out of the province makes it a little bit harder because of all the encouragement of residential development. So I agree with you.
And on top of that, I was at a meeting in the region yesterday, and I was speaking to one of I think it was Pelham, and I was speaking to one of the councillors there, and their mix is 97% residential and 3% commercial. He said the town is going bankrupt because every single thing they have to do in that town has to come from residential taxes. So with the 3% from commercial, there's no development charges. There's none of that income they would get to, create parks and all the other things that BCs do. So if we don't stop the residential and start increasing our 10% up, we're going to be up in the same place, because it's all about residential housing right now. That's all it is. So it's not your fault. I'm just making a comment here. I just want to say that, but we need to find a way to look at how we can increase that 10% to a bigger number. And I'm looking at 20 somehow. We need your help, Matt. We need.
Sure, Councillor. And through you, Mr. Mayor, I think Terry's got a couple of comments she'd like to make as well.
Just the employment policy changes, they don't really take away the fact that you still have those office and commercial uses. It's still recognized in your mixed use areas, and it still has policies regarding heavy employment where you have your manufacturing and stuff like that, and it has transitioned away from that to your more residential areas. So it's not saying that those don't exist anymore. It's just changing the process for removing that designation. Currently, you have to go through that upper tier process for a municipal comprehensive review to change employment areas right now. So it was a much more arduous process to change them, but now they include those office uses. The focus is really trying to get people in transit, and they're a heavy transit user when you have a huge office building in the middle of an employment area. So that's, I think, the thinking that they were trying to say is that some of those uses can really intermix with residential uses. So it's just the location in the town that you have them, not necessarily that they won't be there.
So do we need to identify more areas and draw a red line around them to make sure that it doesn't end up residential?
I think that's where, with our official plan review, we're going to have to look at more mixed-use areas to see where residential and some of our commercial and office uses can go together. to really separate, because we want to keep those manufacturing uses where we have them. We want to have those uses available to have long-term growth, but recognizing that having that mixed use will add to that tax base because it's a bit of more of a variety, but that there's more mixed use areas, like our downtown and Grimsby on the Lake as well, like that Main Street area, where we're mixing the uses and incorporating what is traditionally employment use, where people work, but it's just slightly different policy set.
Okay, thank you. I'm sure there's other questions. I'll come back with others later. I'll let someone else have a go at you. Thank you.
Member Potter.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. First of all, thank you for the report and the presentation. It's good to read. It was an easy read as well, which is always useful. When you've normally done these submissions to the government, have you, I mean, it's in there a little bit, but you said it more when you were talking about it. I find it's always useful to say thank you for the changes that are positive to them. Really flag it. It makes them feel good before you give them the bad news or the questions, recommendations. So I'd encourage that, I think. Second to that is sending a unified message. Have we, as Grimsby, I know Lincoln connection, but have we reached out to other municipalities to see if we're singing off the same song sheet?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, we have, in terms of there's been discussions, we always discuss these big policy changes across the region. We have frequent area planners meetings. This has come up. There's already been kind of a more or less a matrix identified in terms of what we all think the major items are. So there has been levels of collaboration between not just in West Niagara here, but even the region as a whole. So I can confirm those conversations are happening and continue to happen.
Okay. Yeah, it's more about the message being sent and the specific messages. It's, the other one, and it's in the analysis section before you get into the submission. I mean, part of this you mentioned in your presentation about the Indigenous elements and the archaeological, but I'm more focused on the Indigenous. And it said, you know, I think the wording was Grimsby will consider. In this day and age, is that strong enough? I would hope that we would do more than just consider the role of Indigenous consultations. Is that in planning or part of the, maybe part of the official plan coming up? But
So, through you, Mr. Mayor, couple points to be made in that regard. First of all, a lot of the Indigenous consultation currently, it ends up being a regional responsibility. However, you know, we've heard, and again, that was another clarification that was brought forward through some of this legislation that's been tabled, was that, you know, that whole removal of upper tier responsibility on planning items that we've been talking about, the decreased role of the region in planning, likely won't be implemented until at least winter 2024, at least, that's at the earliest. So we're functioning status quo for now, but there's been a lot of conversations about, you know, what this looks like. Can municipalities take that on, that expertise on? It takes, to be a, you know, an engagement specialist in those matters, you have to have some experience. So developing that capability, I think we said we'll consider. And maybe I'll turn to Terry for clarification, but it's definitely, to your point, I think it's definitely something we will be stronger on. It's just right now, there are still a few factors at play in determining how we move forward, but we will be moving forward with more Indigenous consultation and outreach, just because I think it sounds like that's going to be the direction from a policy perspective. But Terry, have you got anything to add?
I think that's actually the language in the draft PPS is will consider the Indigenous consultation. It was more that they've added early, the word early in that section, and they've also talked about built heritage. So we're just not sure exactly what they're looking for, what the intended result is for those conversations. So it's just trying to get a little bit more clarification, especially when treaty issues come up, because there's the role of the Crown and then there's the role of municipalities, and where's that dividing line? Just getting some advice for that can often be tricky. So just getting more information about that from the province. They've talked about guidance for years, but we haven't seen anything at this point.
just one more, Mr. Mayor, if I can. I like your assessment at the end and the recommendations. I always like to give, when I give a recommendation, give them a sort of a get out of jail card as well. If you're making a recommendation, give them a solution on how you can make them look good if they're going to change it. I saw it in some of the proposals, but I didn't see in all of them. I would suggest we may consider that. Secondly, worries me a little bit from, and you said it yourselves, the volume. If this all happened tomorrow, for argument's sake, if they enacted this without listening to the consultation process, the change management and the resourcing required is substantial. And that's why you've asked for delays. Can Grimsby accommodate that with the resourcing? I think that's more a question for council per se, but the change management and the prioritization setting would worry me significantly if this was all enacted. So I know you always have to, I was talking earlier about risk management frameworks, and that's the worst case scenario. Hopefully they'd embrace some of the changes, but if they don't, it's a lot of work and resourcing and all that sort of thing.
Through the mayor, we have put in in the budget proposal, there was staffing considerations. And obviously we're doing an official plan right now, so we might actually be better positioned than some other municipalities because we're already engaging in that process. So part of that review will be looking at all of the policies and all the legislation that will be changing it through that process. So hopefully there won't be too much more, but definitely it's a consideration going forward, but that goes through council's business and budget process. We can't.
Yeah, if I could just add too, I just think one of the things that we're still waiting on, and it seems to be, again, the general theme of what's released is those transitional policies too that guide how we move forward. And I strongly think that there's going to be a lot more information that needs to come forward in that regard, because to Terry's point, I think given our progress and our, kind of foresight and starting our official plan review now, I think we're ahead of the game compared to many other municipalities that might not have attributed the same resource allocations. So that's a little bit of good news, I think, when comparing to some other, especially like-sized municipalities.
Councillor Bradzi.
Thank you, Mayor, through you. I just wanted to come back to, excuse me, to the point where up to 3 lots could be created for as long as the residential use would not hinder the surrounding agriculture operations and not located in the specialty crop. Does that mean like any acre-sized lot up in the mountain can subdivide to 3?
Yeah, through you, Mr. Mayor, potentially. Yeah, any lands that are outside of that Greenbelt policy area or the Niagara Escarpment Plan area up on top there. I think you've got some rural lands, some prime ag lands. Those could be potentially impacted by this, yes. Sure.
Sorry, just one other thing. And that's why we've also asked for some clarification regarding the Greenbelt policies, because there are no severances allowed in that. So they're going to talk about the Greenbelt plan, refer to the old growth plan, but then still have the provincial planning statement. So it might be really confusing. That's why we're asking for further clarification for those sections.
It didn't seem to be extremely clear. But the only other question I wanted to ask too is the goal of them modifying the site plan changes for residential subdivisions under 10 units, is that to kind of streamline to having different set of rules for larger subdivisions and then smaller ones? Is that the goal there? Do you know?
Not necessarily pertaining to subdivisions per se, but I think it's just, it's a move by the province. And again, that was a product of Bill 23. That's just been kind of clarified a little bit more in these documents. But the goal was just for what the province was deeming minor or more minor residential development, which they, utilized the threshold of 10 units or less, then they didn't feel the need to subject it to site plan control because it's a relatively small development and they want to encourage that type of intensification and infill. So yeah, to streamline the process, not having to go through site plan. If they have their land use permissions, they can go straight to building permits. So represents a significant increase in speed in getting those types of developments through potentially. Absolutely.
Then just last one, to go back to the 3 lots. So would we not have any layer of control if someone on an acre lot wanted to split it into 3, as long as they met these 4 requirements in this note?
Go ahead.
And that's why we're asking for some size characteristics with respect to the agricultural properties. right now they don't have any, which they used to always have them. So that's why we're looking for them to include that back, to have some minimum threshold, so you can still have a sustainable farm. They do have a policy in there, and it's very common to talk about it, that it has to be a minimum size to accommodate for sanitary and sewer, like water and sewer, sorry. And that usually is an acre, but if that's it, you just don't want that in the middle of a farm property or in the middle of a rural property. So it's just trying to put it in an area that is less productive. That's sort of what we're trying to approach, because we know that they want to have more housing everywhere, so.
I just have one question further to that. So would planning be able to review a potential severance and offer the severer advice to put it in a certain spot that would be best from a planning perspective? Like, or is that, it hasn't come down that far yet, so you?
Because this is draft, oh, sorry, through the, you, the mayor, we would still have to go through the committee of adjustment for any consent, and there would be, well, like, there would be a review of it and stuff like that. But just if it's in policy, it's just easier to mitigate and manage.
Yeah, and one of the, sorry, Mr. Mayor, but another thing too is it's pretty clear with a lot of these policies in some of the wording that we can't be any more stringent than what the provincial policy is, which is another lens we have to look through when we consider these types of things, so.
Councillor Frake.
I'm back. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. There's so much in here, I don't even know if we're going to get through it all, but let me just see. Okay, we just answered that one. Okay, fine. I don't think we answered it, we just don't know the answer. Growth plan targets, you mentioned that very briefly there, Matt. The targets that were given to us by the region now has been disbanded, is that what I heard? So we had a quota, I mean, if I can call it that we had to build X number of units, I forget how many it was now, up until 2041, maybe one of, maybe Terry can tell me. What was the goals we had? Are they now open for the discussion, or because now that because the region gave us those goals based on what the province gave them, I think, or maybe Matt can speak to it.
So I'll start, and then Terry can chime in with some further details. But yeah, what happened before was the growth plan identified a target for Niagara region as a whole. Right. Then regional staff worked with all the lower tier municipalities to determine what was the right forecast out of that for each lower tier municipality. And that did a whole bunch of things like guide investment in infrastructure, you know, at a regional level, shared infrastructure, things like that. It was a very complex process, lots of consultation. But yeah, all that wording now from the growth plan in terms of handing minimum growth targets down. And again, Terry can give you maybe a little more detail on that, but that hasn't been carried forward in the growth plan. So we don't necessarily have confirmation on what the transition is, but right now the idea is those targets that you're talking about out to 2051.
Yeah, 2051.
For the time being, those are what continue to be in place. But again, ultimately it's going to be up to the municipality now to establish growth targets. And I know where you're going with it, and I think in some ways you figure, oh, well, you know, then maybe we look at an opportunity to maybe, you know, not slow down, not decrease, but maybe.
Or speed it up, whatever.
Well,
we could get aggressive.
You have to, yeah. You have to remember, though, that a lot of it, too, market conditions will continue, you know, to kind of drive what happens to some degree as well. So only thing I would caution is you still have to make sure you're somewhat accurate in your growth targets in terms of what really could happen, because still you have that governs, again, those investments, how you're going to support that growth that is coming one way or another. But maybe I'll let Terry chime in. I think she had a couple more details to share.
Okay.
Yeah, I remember the growth target for the region's plan, I think, is 37,000 for population that we have to meet. We plan to exceed that by 2051, no question. And As part of our official plan, we're going to be using those numbers because that's what the implementation guidelines suggest at this point in time, that we use those 2051 numbers for now. But going forward, we'll have to do our own land needs assessment. And every 5 to 10 years, we'll review our official plan anyways. And at that time is the time that we would look at assessing all of our land needs and seeing what land is taken and how much growth we have to then look at further growth numbers.
When you say going forward, are you talking like when we get to 2051 when we're not here anymore?
No, sorry. No,
And we don't have any say in this?
No,
Or
sorry.
are you talking?
No, like in our like when we review our plan in the next 5 to 10 years.
Right.
After this one our new one is in place, then at its regular cycle of review, then we would look at land needs assessment again.
And we cannot add into that number, or cannot include in that number, the current Bill 23 lifting of those lands out of the Greenbelt?
They do have a
Can they be
specific.
included in that? I mean, I know we probably asked this question before, but just maybe ask it again.
Yeah, they do have a specific policy that those lands for the Greenbelt lands are not allowed to be included in your growth allocation.
Okay, all right. All right. Matt mentioned affordable housing. They're changing you say they're changing the wording about, from affordable housing to would you just go back to that again?
Remind you.
I feel like I've memorized the document at this point. They took out the definition of affordable housing in the PPS that exists today, and really it was more based on market rate, about 80% kind of thing. It has a very standard definition. They're changing that to, remember with Bill 23, they for a lot of the development charges and act and stuff like that, they have they talk about affordable housing. They've not developed that regulation yet. So they've taken the definition out of the provincial planning statement, and we will foreseeably see something when they develop that regulation and how that will fit. They talk about affordable housing, but they really talk about more transitional housing and more relationships with service providers for housing, which would include your long-term care homes, your homes for like
Define that again?
it's a wide range. So any social service program that has a housing component, that's what they're talking about with social service providers. So that's where we wanted a bit more clarification, like how many are we talking to, who are we talking to? But so they really haven't defined some of those answers for affordable housing yet, and that's what we're waiting for, that regulation to come down. And that would foreseeably help us with the interpretation of that section.
Additional needs housing, that's what I
Yeah.
meant before.
That's the words you, additional needs, but
Additional
how
needs.
does, right now with Bill 23 and the two developments in Grimsby, the one at 502 Windward, is it? 502 Windward? 502 Winston, sorry, and the ones over Carmen and Maine, I think Carmen and Maine? Oaks, yeah. Those two developments were subject to the 10% principle. 10% was supposed to be, but we don't know what that is anymore. Because they used affordable housing when they originally put that legislation together, but now it's kind of loose, they don't know what it is, so.
Yeah, I think there's going to be more definition that comes out of Bill 23, because right now, there is still a definition of affordable housing in Bill 23, but what's not clear, it talks about average market value, but we don't know what that means yet. So usually the Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing has information bulletins that they post that identifies how we identify what that average market rate is. That hasn't happened. So that's why we're kind of at a loss. But I think what we're saying here is, regardless, that definition doesn't seem to be included in the draft provincial planning statement, which is interesting because it is still included in Bill 23 conversations.
Thank you for that. So may I go on? May I take control of the meeting? Certification of site plan timing. Did you say my language has been amended to clarify that it's a 60-day period for the review of the site plans? Is that what it is now with Bill 97, is it?
Well, the 60 days has remained. They changed a minor wording. It used to be when 60 days from the date it was submitted. So when the applicant would submit the things, but you might not actually receive it until a couple days later, because it might be Friday versus a weekend kind of thing. So now they've changed it to receipt, so when it's received. So it helps the municipality to say that, oh, we received it this day, not necessarily the day you sent it. So it helps in that respect. What they also added in that section was that proviso that Matt was talking about, where some might be excluded from looking at all of the refunds for that. So that's what we're also looking for.
So we don't know what the definition of that exclusion is?
They said that they could develop a regulation for providing those refunds. And so if they're going to provide a regulation, why, they said some municipalities might not be subject to that. So let's ask if we can be.
So many things we don't know yet. I think you might be lucky. I think I'm done. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Any further questions? Seeing none, thank you very much, Terry and Matt, for all your answers, even though some of them aren't complete, and it's not your fault. The province is working on it, I guess, so. Moved by Councillor Frake, second by Member Drew, resolved that report PA 23-18, Bill 97, and the provincial planning statement dated May 17, 2023 be received, and that report PA 23-18 be submitted to the province to provide the town's comments on the proposed changes. All in favor? That's carried. Any other business? Seeing none, our next meeting is Tuesday, June 6th at 5 p.m. So meeting is adjourned. Good night, everyone. Thank you.